There we go. Hello. All right, we've got, let's see, Karina, we've got Mason, we've got Lucy. So I'm going to say admit all. Hello, says Mason. Hello, Mason. You can use the chat box here while people roll in. Anybody else, if you'd like to greet one another, I'll unmute us in a minute. Maybe get the chat box in circulation here. Okay, so we are recording. Sorry for the delay. We've got now, okay, we've got 17. That's pretty good. How's the audio? You can hear me? Okay, terrific. All right, so let's see. I'm gonna pull up for you. I'm gonna just quickly, actually, before I share my screen, I'm gonna double check our scribe and presenter, or excuse me, news and scribe roles, but I think we have Kami on deck. And I'm going to also make sure that our Canvas page is viewable here. Just give me 1 minute. Things are being mighty slow this morning, I have to admit. A lot of pinwheels on my end. Well, that's right. I figure you know who you are. Matt's here. Good. You probably know who you are. So let me, actually, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. Good. There we go. There's a few sounds of typing, a few sounds of, oh, I see some of you have upgraded your backgrounds. Very nice. Mason, you have a very potent smile. I realize that is a photograph. That might be why.
I couldn't figure out if that was a video or just a picture, you know.
That's right. It's either a photograph or it's Mason's screen is frozen, but I'm going to guess that it's a photograph. Mason, can you hear us? I'm going to unmute you. See if I'm able to unmute you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh,
I've had issues so far being located where I currently am, where trying to stream video for too long has affected the quality of the audio and the video for everyone else. So,
okay. Oh, that seems unfair. Poor everyone.
Yeah, so now I can still hear everybody and see everybody. I will hopefully fix that, but this is kind of how it is for now.
Oh, no problem at all. I'm just glad that you were able to join us in some capacity synchronously. So absolutely, we will figure that unless we see a message from you or from anyone else in the chat box indicating a loss of audio, that you are there, and that we will hear from you intermittently as you're able. So there we go. Okay. So today, yes, we'll hear a little bit of news. I have a couple of short videos, not the Asia panel that I asked you to watch for today, but kind of related news that I wanted to play for you, and we'll probably practice breaking into some of our, I should say, breaking into our breakout rooms in smaller groups to give you a chance to talk in some detail. I'm going to build our small group work around the three thought nugget, or I should say cross-watch responses that we had for today from Morgan, Mackenzie, and Andrew. So let's start though with a little bit of news. Is that you, Kami?
Yeah.
All right, let me try to share the screen. Let's see if I can get this pulled up. Welcome to go ahead and start telling us what you found.
So
there isn't a lot of news coming from China since they're like working really hard on the cases, but also just like, yeah. But the article I found, it briefly mentioned um, the healthcare workers in Hubei province in China using Chinese traditional medicine on over 90% of the coronavirus cases. And they said that they had pretty significant results. And this morning I was doing more reading, and um, I was able to, I don't know where it went. It said they'd been able to use it on 99% of uh, uh, TCM treatment has been given to 99% of patients in makeshift hospitals in Hubei. So
All
I
right.
just thought that was really interesting.
No, it is. And let's see, I think I'm finally where you were going to take us here. Is it this Xinhua Net article?
Yeah, that one, yeah.
Are you all okay? Hopefully. I had to reboot a few things, but hopefully we'll be all back on the same page here in just a moment. Okay.
The article just mentions like the different ways that the doctors in Wuhan have been tackling the coronavirus problem. So, but one of the points that they've mentioned is using TCM to treat.
Right. Now,
And
and
they
Amy,
want to spread the message to other physicians or healthcare workers fighting it across the globe.
yeah, maybe I can find. There it is. Yeah, this passage.
Yeah,
Very
the
interesting.
combination.
And Amy, you had shared something similar to this on Tuesday. Is that right? Are you here, Amy?
I think I shared. I think it was they're practicing it at Beijing though.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. Yeah. So this is maybe just scrolling back here to Amy's news. Oh, right. Okay. So both in Beijing and in Wuhan.
And then as I was doing my research, I found this really small like article, but they're using magnolia bark to treat drug-resistant epilepsy. So I thought that was pretty non-coronavirus related.
That's very cool and much needed relief from what we're going to be talking about today. So thank you for that. Let's have a look at this. Okay. Huh.
You know, very, very brief, but
Yeah.
they used it. They treated fish and mice. So I don't know if it's ready for humans yet, but hopefully.
Wow. This is very exciting. This is something that assuming I get to teach my bioprospecting class again in the fall. We talked about magnolia bark last semester, and so I will definitely tuck this away for that group. Thank you very much for this. Very exciting stuff. But more of an optimistic cue to this news, given there's some pretty heavy economic news today, and certainly the ongoing updates with coronavirus are heavy. But I hope that you're finding ways to both critically and thoughtfully consume news and in doses. But thank you very much for this. Anybody else have something? I think I'm going to take us back here to news. I post things intermittently, but I wanted to reiterate that even if you're sort of out of cycle, or if you've already done news, if there's something that you just really want us to know about, feel free to go ahead and post here. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of things I've shared. One is, yes, so I've tried to make clear when I'm posting something that is labeled as an opinion, but Yanzhong Huang is one of the experts from the film panel that we watched for today. He refers to his piece in the Times, so I wanted to make sure that you had access to that. And then I had one more. Oh, we're going to spend a few minutes on also doing this, I think, in small groups, which we'll break into in a minute. But I'm just absolutely obsessed with this particular article that I think we can say in this terms for something, for content going viral, sort of has new meaning now, maybe double, if not triple meaning here. But this is something I want us to take a look at as a group. So I'll just flag that. And okay, terrific. Now, I'm gonna try to get the, okay, I'm looking, I don't know why I'm looking at Connor, but I only see Connor right now. Hi, Connor.
Hi.
I wonder why is this happening? There's just a few things that still baffle me. I see some sleepy, I see some rubbing of eyes. Of course, is anyone else finding it extremely difficult to stop touching their faces? Yeah, it is so hard. I was thinking about getting like 4-inch acrylic nails to try to retrain my mind to stop, especially when I'm thinking and I'm sort of doing that thinker face. It's hard. I figure social isolation is much more plausible for me than the complete stopping of the touching of the face. But I wouldn't normally notice it quite so acutely. It's just that all of your cherubic faces are very large on my screen right now, which is good. Okay. So we had, I hope you found this panel interesting. I'll pull, I guess I'm still sharing my screen, aren't I? Well, what the heck, if I'm still, oh, this is getting very confusing to me now. That is yesterday's, or Tuesday's class. I'm trying to pull up here, is, oh, where did it go? Oh, hang with me, everybody, I'll get there. There we go, okay, go back to this video. Posted under modules. There we are. And I'm just curious, actually, Mason, you already weighed in on this, but in general, is it easier for you to watch things that are, or I should say, does it stream more lightly if you watch something that is already uploaded to YouTube as opposed to something that I attach as like a .mov?
Anything that's like a file, whether it be YouTube or on Canvas, because I can generally adjust the quality of like what it's playing back as. If I like turn it on and then I can like leave it a second to buffer, it's not like slow. It's just that like it's limited, so it's not always good about like continuous things. So whenever I'm streaming a call, especially with a bunch of people all having video streams, that's when it starts to get a little overloaded.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll figure that this is, well, just let me know if you're not, and this is for everybody, if you're not able to access things because of the nature of the files that I post. So here we are. Do you see this? This is sort of looks like a flyer. And I'll ask, maybe Phoebe, can you read the title just so I know that you really can see it?
Yeah, it says Asia Beyond the Headlines, Going Viral, the Coronavirus and its Regional and Global Implications.
Okay, great. And it's a little pixelated, but here we have, I realize only after watching this a few times, here we have the actual list of all of the participants with their titles. Maybe I can make this a little bigger. Almost readable, at least names. So Bloom Huang, Jones.
I know if
you do?
It's also in the about of the video.
Oh, you learn things every day. You mean down here? Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I completely forgot to look there. Okay, so we have public health expert. We have someone from the Council on Foreign Relations who works in diplomacy, international relations. We have a historian. We have an anthropologist. Somebody who works. These are again a lot of these people. Bless you. From health policy and economics, right? So I know a number of you have longstanding interest in public health and are probably maybe even more seriously now, thinking about doing graduate work in public health. So I thought it was worth making sure you know some of these names. These would be people who are already publishing widely within academia, a number of them in more journalistic sources as well. And of course, we have our I guess the OG of medical anthropology, Arthur Kleinman. Is that fair? Am I using that term correctly? Without really knowing what it means. Good. So it's an all-star group, and I know that there are moments in this panel that are a little bit slow. So I hope you tabbed forward where you needed to. But also, in some ways, to me, let's see. I'm going to ask Matt. You're kind of in the shadows of your hood there, but I think that's you. When was this panel originally aired? No, it was not a live stream, of course, for us, but
I think it was February 20, I think 8th it says.
yeah. So that feels like a million years ago by some, in terms of sort of the media world. That's, in fact, that is almost a month ago. Hard for me to believe it, but that was kind of partly the spirit for some of my questions, my open questions for you to consider as you were viewing. Knowing that this panel was almost, sounded like the attitude of the group that got together was that, well, we don't really know if this will be worth our while by the, if we say we need 2-3 weeks to throw this thing together. So, they were already thinking about it early February, say, and certainly before then as individuals, but thinking we need to draw attention to this. And so it's always, it's a strange thing for me to think back, even just as we've, been together as a class, how much this was already on our minds to some degree, right from the very beginning, say middle, late January. But of course, they even make this now, I think, sort of painful joke right at the beginning, saying, "Oh, large gatherings, kind of like this one, are probably about to be banned or are already being banned, right? In China and this sort of thing." So there were a number of kind of moments of reflection that I felt, even just watching this, say 2 weeks ago, watching it last week. We just sort of experienced some of the material differently. And I certainly know what my reactions are, and I have a few notes that I want to make that I share with you, but I would love to hear just kind of popcorn style from those of you maybe who didn't post, but who just had a couple of responses to this. And it could be anything from the viewing experience to the range of topics. I think one of my prompts was, how much of this seems still very relevant? Does any of it seem dated? There's always that question of what is the role of the historian in a breaking crisis, which fascinates me. But what did you think?
I thought it was refreshing to kind of get news and opinions from people who are like experts in the field, except for instead of just someone that might not know more of the history and like the anthropology side of it. So I felt like they really went in depth with how they thought about each issue, and thought about I liked all the history. Like they went through SARS and kind of the differences. And so just them being anthropologists, I thought that was refreshing for me, because I could trust them and trust the information.
Yeah, there did seem to be, I must say, part of I think maybe the trade-off of information that is sometimes delivered certainly in a calmer format, definitely a sort of a lower production value, maybe something that is based on a lifetime of methodical research, right? It has a very different, it feels different, it lands differently, doesn't it? And so that's actually why, to the extent I'll anticipate that some of you may have experienced a few yawns at points, but I will take a yawn over breaking out into a sweat right now. Like for a while, I needed that change of pace. So thanks, Connor, for that. Anybody else?
I thought it was interesting that they talked about the second wave before it like really hit, because now we're seeing that China is starting to have more cases after it going down to like virtually none, since they're having people come back from abroad. So like knowing that this was recorded like a month ago before this happened, it was interesting saying that they like predicted it would happen.
And can you say more about the when you say return, what's the direction to the wave that you're talking about, Katrina?
So I read an article, I think a couple of days ago, about somebody that came from Turkey, I believe, back to China. It's people who were away during like the initial lockdown and then are now returning now that the numbers started to go down, but now they're bringing it back to China.
Right. So certainly decentering this, I guess, if we look back to this title, sort of Asia beyond the headlines, it's almost like it's flipped now, sort of the headlines beyond Asia, right? And now back, this is no longer, right? This is no longer, if this were to be organized today, it wouldn't be primarily or exclusively sponsored by the Asia Center, right? But yeah, absolutely. It's something that will, I'll toggle through just a few highlights for you in a moment that look at that problem of the second wave, which is something that unfortunately is already very much occupying the back of my mind when I think about summer school in the fall. But anyway, back to the present. Anybody else?
I really thought it was interesting how they were able to just like speak despite of political restrictions, and like they were just able to just go after each individual, like at the time, like the Chinese government and like the WHO, and then just speak about like why the things didn't work without like a, or without having to consider like political relations between countries and things like that. So not really having to sugarcoat anything that they were saying.
Yeah, and is it, I'm suddenly very self-conscious. Is it Mikai or Makai? Have I been emphasizing your name incorrectly all semester long?
Honestly, at this point, I don't really know.
Well, why don't you just remind me, because it was only when you said the other day, it's me, and then you said, and I said, who's me? And you said, it's Mikai, and I thought, oh. So let me get it right once and for all.
It's Mikai.
Mikai.
Yeah. So either way works, but yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I apologize for that. Mikai. Okay. So are you talking about a particular panelist? Are you thinking about, when you say they?
It was partially like Professor Yip, and then like she definitely really went into just like why the Chinese healthcare system and like why the Chinese public health system like didn't do its job very well, and like what could have been done better almost.
Right. Yeah, that was probably one of the most.
Yeah, but I think also just like everyone speaking kind of gave like some time to the idea that like while the country may be prepared for like something like SARS or the coronavirus or like COVID-19 to come about, they're never going to be like prepared forever almost. And I think the main issue with the US that was brought up was just that like the whole group of people who was like designed and like their whole job was to like deal with this got fired last year. So like and then the whole issue about like how the WHO just didn't use any of the like basically any of its ability to just like call out individual countries and like make non-national declarations of like of international pandemics.
And
so
it's
just
sort of,
like
yeah, it sounds like it's your interpretation of some of this criticism that was coming from this panel, which I agree. Thank goodness there was no, as far as we understand, right, no censorship of this group of scholars. And they would know, right, of all the people who would have known the difference between being pressured to communicate or speak or publish one way or another, that this would be the group, that this lack of calling out, to use your words, has as much to do with the decimation of the departments and the offices that would have been, you were previously in place to fill that role, right, as much as necessarily some public health experts saying, I'm not really in the mood to talk about this, but rather the sort of the absence of coordination around sort of amplifying that message. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, yeah, because I think it was specifically Professor Bloom in a Q&A where he was talking about like, yeah, we as a country, like the U.S., was prepared to deal with this up until last year.
Yes, I was absolutely gutted when he said that.
Yeah.
But again, it's also, well, someone, if that's the case, someone needs to say it, and we'll have to be thinking about that for a while. Absolutely. How about one more response or comment? I know it was sort of a long. Oh, good. I see the actual hand of Simran, and there's also, of course, remember the little blue hands. If you know how to raise them, go for it.
I forgot how to do the virtual hand. What's the shortcut for that?
I think it was Alt-Y, or
Okay.
if you're on a Mac.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I thought like it was interesting how within the first 5 minutes the moderator defined stigma and warned against associating a disease with a particular population. And it's hard for me to like retrospectively look. I know we talked about racism and the coronavirus in class before spring break, but I can't remember like at what point in time the anxiety really like skyrocketed, and I can't remember if this panel like came before that or after that, but I think it's interesting that it was like one of the first things that was said.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree, and I think Cynthia might remember.
Yeah, so kind of like going off of that too, I think it was interesting how like he started out with that and it almost like he ended with that, because at the very end there was like a lot of questions about like mainly China, and then he was like, so like although it like might have started there's also been a lot of cases in other countries like South Korea and like Hong Kong and like different places. So I thought that it was interesting how like not only did he start with it, but he ended with it to just kind of remind us like it's not just in China, and it's not like a Chinese disease, like it's happening like worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think it's very important to revisit this, because I also agree, even just on the very, very local level of our own campus, which I know for many of you feels very distant right now, but I believe the first real mention of stigma for our group came up around I think sort of now in retrospect, kind of naive question about are you seeing postings reminding you to wash your hands? And somebody said, oh, well, we're seeing as much sort of flyering around campus in regards to fighting a stigma, the active sort of real-time stigmatization of this virus as we are seeing hand washing reminders. I think that's how it came up, and that was sort of the first time it dawned on me that this is happening. And now unfortunately I have to think, well, of course it's happening. This is what happens. And I've assigned a couple of new articles for next week that I think will be really helpful for giving us better language and also historical perspective on how and why this seems to happen with pandemics. Right, okay. So I want to try this. I know we practiced our breakout rooms on Tuesday, and I would like to try to create breakout rooms with Morgan and Mackenzie and Andrew distributed. So it'll be, let's stop the share here. Okay, good. And I'd like for you to, while I'm doing this, well, we'll just see what happens. I'm going to do the manual breakout. Okay. Six per room. And I'm going to assign Amy, Karina, Connor, Jack, Kami, Mackenzie will be 1, and I'm going to call you. Oh, this is brilliant. Okay, I'm going to put Katrina, Mason, Matt, Kai, Morgan into 1, and Phoebe. And then Rachel, Simran, Adriana, Cynthia, and Lucy into 1. Now let's see, hopefully you're receiving an invitation now to go into your breakout room. And I'd like for you to join your smaller room. If I did this right, one poster will be in each room. I have to double check this. Oh, Mason, you are unassigned. Let me assign you.
I am trying to call in with my computer to see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There, you are admitted. Okay. Oh, wow, look at that. That is way more high tech than I was expecting. That's a beautiful sunset where you are, Mason.
Well, actually, that's a picture I took of seagulls.
Oh. Wow.
So.
Oh, am I in?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Hang on a second. Am I in a room with you and Katriana? I'm not. Okay. Hopefully, I'm just double checking that now where? Oh, where is Andrew? Oh, is Andrew not here? Okay.
Yeah.
Like, this is not going to be the end of the world.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
Dropping in. Hopefully, this is not a surprise when this happens. I would love to know. I've been sending broadcasts that are supposed to go to each breakout room. I've just learned the hard way that there is a word limit on how many words you can type in your broadcast message. So if you received a partial message, that is probably why.
Got two.
You did. Okay. Now, is it
Mhm.
in the chat? It's not in the chat. I just don't know where these messages go. I send them out and then
They just pop up and then disappear.
They do. Oh, is that what happens? Okay.
It's just like a little banner that comes across. It doesn't stay.
Okay.
Should.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to delegate instructions before I put you in your breakout rooms for the future. But Mackenzie, did you get a chance to kind of elaborate on your posting?
Yeah, I was talking about like the rhetoric of like using the term draconian and how like we were talking about it in class, like how I think there's like a difference between the way we like viewed Italy locking down their country and China locking down their country. And like one was like seen as, oh, this is harsh, severe, and like an abuse to liberty, like civil liberties. And the other one was like, they're protecting their people because they have no choice.
Yeah.
And so we touched on that. And then we also touched on like, he mentioned that a report that was really important for like having like a virus information was like published only in English and not in Chinese, and like how like countries should be working together, especially during this time because it's a global pandemic. But like a lot of times, like you don't see the United States interacting with other countries, but like China's been interacting with like Italy, and I know like South Korea's been doing lots of different initiatives and things like that. Even like Cuba went to Italy to like go and help. So I just like think that kind of rhetoric is interesting because like one could say that like we're being very isolation based, like, and not helping other people or like not asking for help. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say in response to that, the WHO and the CDC cannot like legally go provide aid without a formal invitation from a country. So like the time that it took for the US to get to China and the WHO to enter China with health aid was all dependent on when the Chinese government requests aid. It's like just a procedural thing.
Makes sense. I'm wondering like why like we like I know we needed a bunch of like
like imperialistic propaganda and like neocolonialism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I feel
that's my 2 cents.
Even the criticisms that are legitimate are just so seeped in that imperialistic attitude of how much better we are than China that it's not effective in actually achieving any sort of change or positive.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. Is like, even though there are legitimate things to criticize, any kind of like criticism that I generally tend to see from like the mainstream like news outlets is just like there's ulterior motives and ulterior purposes that make it for me no longer legitimate criticism.
Yeah, see, I think you have a very good point, but like there's the difference between like at least what I've seen with the criticism that the panel was giving and then the criticism that like mainstream media is giving was like exactly what you were saying. Like the media has been saying that like China's just been bad at everything, but like the panel did give China credit for like once things actually got past the bureaucratic like red tape, they did things very quickly and very efficiently. But it was just like getting to that point was China's big issue.
Yeah.
And like,
I mean, I think a lot of like professionals and like scientists are better at being like less politically motivated than a lot of like news outlets are, for sure. But also it's like, I don't know, like the kinds of news that we consume, like for example, like I was seeing a lot of things like comparing the coverage of coronavirus in China to the coverage of coronavirus in Italy, and like certain things like, oh, like it would be like both like in like the Wall Street Journal or something, and it'd be like, oh, like Italy like sacrifices all these things and is doing a great job by telling all its people to quarantine, and then it would
near term to be able to get to a place where something like that some people might say is like more akin to like an authoritarian country, which I've really not been happy with, like the way that people have been thinking about that a lot. Like I feel like it's not as likely to happen here.
Yeah, I don't feel like the US is in like anywhere close to a state where they could do something like that. And like the level of response is just completely different. Because like I know people in China who like they came back from study abroad and then they went to China and like every single day a government official has gone to their house to check their temperature, like every single day for 2 weeks. Whereas like people who have come back from study abroad here, it's just like one temperature check in the airport and then they let people through. So just like the level and response is hugely different, and I don't think that the US government has the level of control necessary to implement something like that.
I also think some of it is like pretty cultural. Like, I think in the United States, there's like this strong emphasis on like individual rights and like autonomy, whereas like in China, the response has largely been like, we need to do this as a collective, like this is for like the greater good sort of thing. Like, we had a family friend who went back like a month ago because his mom passed away, and like he had to quarantine, and he broke quarantine, and like the neighbors literally reported him. Like, it wasn't even like government officials were there that like saw that he broke quarantine. It was that like neighbors who like knew him and knew his family reported him because they were like, you shouldn't have done that. Like, that puts everyone in danger. And I just like cannot imagine that happening here ever. Like, no one would do that. They would be like, that's their business. So that's like definitely
Yeah. Karina's back.
Hello.
Hi.
Me? Oh, hey.
I hope I didn't. Did I fail to assign you to a room or?
No, I was in a
Okay.
room.
Oh, good. Okay.
Um,
You just actually
I
are
accidentally
minding the
clicked.
time.
I think I accidentally clicked the return to.
No problem. You're just a few seconds ahead of everyone else. That's absolutely fine. I think the rooms are gonna just close spontaneously in about 10
Oh, okay.
seconds. So no problem.
Gotcha.
There, now everybody's back. Hello again.
Hello.
I have a question. Is it creepy when I just sort of appear and you don't know when it's gonna happen? Okay. Feels a little bit creepy to
Yeah,
me.
permanently.
Oh no.
Did you say permanently?
Yeah.
That was the last. Yeah, we were one word away from finishing.
Oh. We were talking about like small businesses that are in St. Louis that are going to be closing permanently as a result of this, and like I guess we said Hopcat and Bobo's Noodle House are permanently closed.
Oh my god, that cat
was
is
it
so
because
cute,
of
Karina.
No.
Hopcat closed?
Yeah.
Did they close because of this?
Yeah, Hopcat and Bobo's.
Oh.
That's insane. Wow.
We were saying that like someone predicted that 70% of restaurants would go out of business.
That's so high.
That's depressing.
I mean, they're also talking about the potential for like 20 to 30% unemployment if things don't get fixed. So it's just
Yeah.
so many of the workers that are going to be impacted. Like at this point, there's supposedly an expansion of unemployment insurance, but otherwise, like, we've literally already spent more than half of our federal budget for last year, and the direct impact to most Americans is going to be $1,200.
Yeah, in May probably, which is like doesn't even cover 1 month of rent for a lot of people.
Yeah, but also the messed up thing about that is that for lower income people, they could only get up to, or like they could get a check for 600 instead of 1,200. So it's like the lower your income, the less money you actually get.
Right, because it's like means tested. Yeah.
Because that makes sense.
Speaking Makai.
I'm listening to see how if this chat sort of converges once again on, and I think I'm actually very curious to see how we went from the sort of Asia Beyond the Headlines to St. Louis. Did that happen in each of your groups? Let me ask Jack, Phoebe, and Adriana, since you are the reps. I heard actually in my dropping in and out of each of your chats, I noticed that it almost was as though I was just rebooting the same conversation. So I was very curious to notice that the theme of government responsibility, stigma in news coverage, and sort of these different emerging narratives around China's response, US response, and even Italy's response seemed to be what everyone was talking about. But anything else that we should highlight that may have been derived from the panel we watched, or perhaps something else that's on your minds?
We sort of talked a lot about the social media response that was sort of brought up by Iretsky in the panel.
Mm-hmm.
And
oh yes, the text messaging.
Yeah, and just sort of the differences in like US responses versus responses by people in China. Like I believe Lucy in our group mentioned people in China posting a lot more serious responses in regards to COVID-19, and sort of people in the US more focusing on, like, I don't know, positive ways to spend your day and things like that. So just sort of the difference between the two locations, and also just how like different sort of places in the response can sort of change the way that people post online.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me about this, the sort of the pace of response. This is one of the news media or sort of the news articles that I've posted. We'll have to save this for kind of a warm-up activity for Tuesday of next week, but looking at the question of who drives the narrative in the era of social media, given that Uretsky's comments were more looking back on a million years ago, 2003, with SARS, where response and political activity had to happen on a much smaller scale, and sort of with the use of this is when I was in college, and this seemed just incredible how many people you could reach with a single text message, but it pales in comparison to what happens now. Yeah, thank you for that, Adriana. And Phoebe, your group.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about like the different ways that like the US media kind of framed like what was happening in China at the time when it wasn't in the US yet, versus like now that it's in the US, versus like how the crisis in Italy was being framed, and how like in the beginning, like in maybe like February and January, when the virus was contained mostly to China and it wasn't quite in the US yet, there were like a lot of like criticisms of the Chinese government, some of which were like at the time seemed to be like legitimate criticisms, like in terms of like how countries should respond to pandemics. But now that like we're kind of dealing with a lot of it, and it's like very obvious that we haven't prepared or learned at all from like what we were originally criticizing the Chinese government for. It seems more likely that like at the time perhaps the media was more interested in like, I mean, I guess like the media and the government aren't necessarily directly tied, but they're tied in many ways. And that like it seems like obvious now that a lot of things might have been more about like just like political criticisms of like a government that is like not friendly to us, and like also like socialist, communist, and like just a lot of like anti-CCP, like anti-China like coverage that now like, and like also just like in the ways that the like the way that the Chinese government handled it versus the way that the Italian government handled it, and the way that like we were criticizing China and not necessarily, and like celebrating the Italian government for like doing the same things is like very, very interesting. And like, so now that there's a lot of like anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment, it seems kind of silly to act like it came out of nowhere when like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journals for like months pushed all this like anti-Chinese, anti-CCP propaganda.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think that also is reflected really nicely in the panel that we watched. The way that social, political, historical context just comes front and center, and we cannot and should not divorce any of this conversation from this sort of tendency to interpret what's happening in another country in light of how the political structures are already being described. I see, Mason, you've got a hand up.
I was just gonna, in the same vein, or as like an extension of that, is like that I've seen a lot, and partly it's because more of what I'm getting now is like more Missouri focused versus national focused. But I've heard from Mike Parsons specifically about the idea that like Missouri just like didn't have the capacity to respond to this in the way that they like could have been most effective, and now just like really can't. And so I've encountered a lot of like American exceptionalism that's been kind of running through everything of like, oh, China should have done XYZ, and now like a month later those exact things were things that like, oh, we couldn't do or we wouldn't do because we're America. And so that I think has added into the fact that like no matter, it's the constant like moving of the fence posts to still find a way to be directing bad faith critique.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And something else like on the vein of like American exceptionalism that like I was just like personally thinking about like in my own head is a kind of interesting. I think like a lot of the criticism of like people not social distancing kind of fell on like our age group. And I think what's really interesting about our particular age group is that like since we were born, the US has pretty much been at constant war, but we've never felt it, and it's never been something that's directly like on our home turf besides like maybe 9/11, but we were like 2 and like barely, and like that's not necessarily even comparable. And so we've never felt anything quite like this, like that is like meant to affect a lot of people directly at home. And I think that also plays a lot into like American exceptionalism and like why a lot of people in our age range are not taking it very seriously is because like things always happen like not to us and like always happen to like other people, and like a lot of like the violence in the world is like US violence and imperialism enacted against other countries and like not something that we deal with the consequences of at all. So I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Ruby.
Oh,
is that Jack?
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
I also so the like I think there's been a shift in rhetoric recently too, like along this war point, and like honestly, like the past week and how the people are talking about the virus, especially in positions of power, as a war. And it like kind like when the president started talking about that using like war terms, at least like from what I noticed, it was like around the same time he started calling it like China virus, we're at war with this China virus. And like just the like association of those like 2 words, like war and then adding China in front of virus, like it just feeds into this idea that this is something that like is out of our control and that like we're under attack by a foreign power.
And where can I ask, where else have we heard this association of China and war, but not fast war in the sense of the fast violence of actual combat recently? Really throughout the Trump presidency, where else have we heard this talk of war? Metaphorical war.
Trade war? Economic war?
Economic war, trade war. Right, so it almost, and in a sense, that's why it's a really helpful observation, Jack, I think because it's totally naturalized to the ear and to the eye at this point to think of the U.S.-China relationship as being one of fundamental conflict. And I wonder if that is allowing certain conspiracy theories from many sides, or maybe no side in particular in some cases, to go viral or to take root. So yeah, no, I hear that absolutely, and let's sort of keep monitoring that as we go along. Because this has just come up anyway, I feel like it might be appropriate to share a short video. I want to take just our last 5-6 minutes of class to share with you a brief piece. St. Louis has come up, the metaphors and language of war have come up, and also, of course, we've been talking about histories and sort of comparisons of what's happening now with, and something we'll do much more next week, but with SARS. We'll talk about H1N1. These are all 20th century, 21st century epidemics, pandemics. But I want to take it back an entire century and just ask you, have you already been thinking about, in any way, whether on your own, in your other classes, this point of comparison that just seems to make more and more sense in some ways with the 1918 influenza pandemic? Is this something you've already kind of been thinking about? I'm getting a couple of nods. Okay, well, it might be. All right, I think in part because I know we were already having some St. Louis love there as we came back from our breakout rooms. And just so you know, I'm doing everything in my power to buy as much takeout from all of the restaurants and places you've been mentioning. It seems like the right thing to do. For example, yesterday I had a porch dinner with my neighbors where we sort of hollered at one another. And we got takeout. Well, I guess this doesn't really count as takeout, but we got Andy's, I will say that much. So we're going to do everything in our power to keep Andy's in business. This is my personal commitment to you, so that there will be things for you to dine on if and when you return to St. Louis, if you have in fact left St. Louis. But let me show you this, because there's some really incredible footage of, this is a sort of a news piece that I was looking for something brief, and of course it's just so timely. This just was released a couple of days ago. I'm going to share this audio with you. Am I sharing my screen here? St. Louis in the flu of 1918? Is that what you see?
Yep.
St. Louis in the news, sort of. Not because of the cases here, but because of the lessons learned just over 100 years ago, when the city showed the rest of the country how to handle an epidemic. And no, not everybody was happy about it. The big news in October of 1918 was the Allied offensive, the Battle of the Argonne Forest. Americans, St. Louisans, were there fighting and dying, and hoping this war would be over soon. But there was another battle, another war going on, an invasion that would kill more people than the Great War, here in St. Louis and around the world.
Not quite a one-off event, but a rare event. We've had perhaps a half a dozen pandemics that we know about going back to the 1700s.
On October 4th, the enemy had arrived in the city. The papers reported the first confirmed cases of the flu. Normally, that wouldn't be news. People got the flu back then, or the grip, just like we do. They didn't know much about viruses, about how the flu virus is constantly mutating and changing. But they did know that this one was different. They called it the Spanish flu.
Why the 1918 flu was highly transmissible is not well worked out.
Former SLU public health professor, Dr. Alan Zelikow.
In terms of the symptoms, it was far, far worse. And in terms of the age of the population that it affected, it tended to affect young people, say late teenage years through early 30s.
St. Louis's health commissioner, Dr. Max Starkloff, knew what the flu was doing in other cities, and when it got here, he went straight to the Board of Aldermen. They passed a bill requiring doctors to report all cases of influenza, and as a reportable disease, the mayor could then proclaim an epidemic. And that gave broad powers to the health commissioner to close public places where the disease could be spread. Mayor Henry Keel said nothing yet warranted such drastic action. Starkloff probably knew better.
In Boston, for example, in September of 1918, there was a sudden spike, and it wasn't long until Philadelphia got hit. It was only a week or two later that cases appeared in Pittsburgh and then in Chicago. He knew it was coming because he read the papers and he was on the phone with his colleagues in Chicago and on the East Coast. He knew it was coming. He watched it march across the country. He expected it to arrive. He predicted practically the day it arrived.
In just a few days, the flu was spreading fast through St. Louis, and people were starting to die. Starkloff didn't mess around with half measures. On October 7th, he ordered the immediate closing of theaters, moving picture shows, schools, pool and billiard halls, lodges and society meetings, dance halls, conventions, public funerals, and churches. He got support from church leaders who encouraged and instructed members on how they could worship at home.
Just the empirical observation of people gathering together who coughed, forget about the organism for a second, was enough to put into effect public health measures here that were extraordinarily effective if you compare St. Louis to other cities.
Soldiers returning from the war in Europe undoubtedly were bringing the Spanish flu home to the East Coast ports and then bringing it west. But it might well have been an American soldier who brought the flu to Europe in the first place. Dr. Zelikoff suggests a better name for the Spanish flu might be the Haskell County flu.
So no one knows where it began, but I think the weight of evidence is that it began in Kansas. What's believed to have happened is that the organism transmitted directly from the natural host, which are birds, directly from that host into humans. What makes influenza both so fascinating and so pesky is that the genome, its genetic structure, is on 8 separate strands. To the best of my knowledge, there's no other virus that has this. So that means if some animal or bird is infected with 2 different influenza viruses, meaning one influenza virus with 8 strands and another influenza virus with 8 strands at the same time, there's nothing to say that that virus, which must live inside of cells, can't reproduce inside of those cells, and some of those genes swap. So out comes an influenza virus that now has new properties that had never been seen before, perhaps.
And it might have been an infected Haskell County farm boy who reported for duty at Fort Riley, Kansas. The flu was especially a problem in military posts, like Jefferson Barracks, where men were crowded together in barracks and in hospital wards. St. Louis Congressman Jacob Meeker went to Jefferson Barracks on October 9th to talk about the need for more masks for those taking care of the sick. A week later, the congressman was dead at the age of 40. On his deathbed, Meeker married his secretary, Alice Redmond. Everyone in the hospital room was wearing masks. So many of the photographs of that deadly season are people in masks, nurses, police, teachers. Even the Washington University football team donned masks for this photo, but they may not have played. So many of the sporting events were being canceled as well. And it was working, but every time it looked like the flu was easing up, cases would spike again. Starkloff ordered more closings and restrictions. He limited store hours, he banned children under 16 from going into businesses, and police officers kept people moving along and broke up small gatherings. In November, with the war coming to an end, Starkloff used the upcoming armistice celebration on Monday, November 11th, to create a 4-day holiday, closing all businesses. This was costing a lot of people a lot of money. The Chamber of Commerce objected, and despite the economic consequences and political pressure, Starkloff still had the backing of Mayor Keel,
who recognized that this was going to be a disaster if they didn't get ahead of the epidemic curve, and they did.
The flu epidemic continued the rest of the year before it ran its course. Starkloff didn't lift the closings and restrictions until December 28th of 1918. In those few months, the Spanish flu took the lives of 1,700 St. Louisans. But without Starkloff's quick and determined actions, it could easily have been twice that many.
I think because he was just phenomenally convinced, and he would not rest until he got the opportunity to enforce what he knew was the right thing to do.
And it worked.
It definitely worked.
Simran, welcome back. I hope you weren't waiting for a long time there. All right, so I was a tiny bit concerned that the audio was off, but then when I saw when the WashU football team reference
Scary as
came,
these times could be, our community
hang on a second.
has battled through a similar pandemic before. 1918, Spanish flu.
There we
was
go.
Responsible.
Oh dear, it's the YouTube rabbit hole. Let me come back to this. Your faces went, oh wow, WashU football team, and that was when I knew for sure that you were watching what I was watching. So kind of uncanny series of comparisons that still to me feel, despite the sort of the black and white, the different costuming, the complete lack of advice around hand washing from 1918. So relevant. There are of course limits to the comparison. Influenza and coronavirus, very different viruses, but the public health response, I think it's good to take note. And again, even if we have to expand our kind of historic time frame, a century or beyond, I think right now that can only be helpful. And believe it or not, what I've just shown you is supposed to be a story of hopefulness and optimism about the relatively, well, it's an extremely unpopular response of one public health leader, right? Max Starkloff. I think for Tuesday, I'd like to know who you think the Max Starkloff of 2020 is in this country right now. Does St. Louis have one? If you're missing St. Louis, you might want to follow some of the lines. Mason's saying no. Anyway, I realize I have to let you go now, but it's fascinating to me, and I would be very curious if you wanted to, whoever's doing news or anyone else on for Tuesday, to think about St. Louis vis-a-vis other U.S. cities from 1918. There are a number of really famous and frightening cases that have become sort of textbook examples of the right way to do social distancing that we learned at least partially from 1918. So I guess you are I'm not hearing anybody. So I'm just looking at your faces now. Shall I say farewell for now? You good? All right, okay. We'll see you again on Tuesday. I've posted the readings and I'll send a follow-up email, but it's working. We're getting there. This is getting better. I'm excited. Okay, bye. 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 Bye.